The organ music was playing Pachelbel's canon, but the sound was entirely drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears. I stood at the back of the cathedral, the heavy silk of my wedding dress pooling around my ankles. In my right hand, I held a thick, cream-colored envelope. The wax seal was already broken. 30 feet away, Liam stood at the altar. He looked handsome, but his eyes were darting toward the front pew, specifically toward my mother, Victoria. She had just leaned over and whispered something to him. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were. I saw the exact moment the lie took root in his brain. His jaw tightened, his posture stiffened. He looked at me not with love, but with a sudden, profound disgust. Victoria had just told him I was pregnant with another man's baby. She'd done it right before the music started, playing the role of the devastated, protective mother, sacrificing her own happiness to protect the family name. She thought she had checkmated me. She thought I would break down, cry, and run out the side door, saving her from having to explain herself. She made a fatal miscalculation. I didn't run. I stepped forward. The guests murmured in confusion as I bypassed the traditional walk down the aisle and walked straight up the center, my eyes locked on Liam. When I reached the altar, I didn't say a word. I just held out the cream-colored envelope. Liam stared at it, his face pale. He said, "What is this?" he whispered. "The truth," I said, my voice perfectly level. He took it. He pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I watched the color drain completely from his face. Before I tell you what was on that page and how my mother's desperate lie unraveled 2 families, take a quick second to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. To understand why I didn't walk down the aisle, you have to understand the house I grew up in. We lived in a fading 3-story Victorian house on the edge of a gentrifying neighborhood. It always smelled faintly of lemon polish and damp plaster. The floorboards groaned in specific places, a constant reminder that the foundation was rotting, much like the family living inside it. The heavy ticking of the hallway grandfather clock was the only sound that ever filled the silence between us. Victoria ruled that house with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. She was obsessed with the illusion of wealth. Every surface was covered in faux antique knickknacks she bought on credit. The hierarchy was simple. Victoria was the queen, and I was the invisible staff. My older brother had been the golden child, but he passed away when I was 10. Victoria never replaced him. She just redirected her bitterness toward me. I was the reminder of her aging, the reminder of her failures. I learned early on to keep my head down and do the work. While Victoria hosted lavish, debt-fueled dinner parties to impress people she barely liked, I was in the kitchen washing the crystal. I was the one who balanced her checkbook. I was the one who noticed the discrepancies. That was my secret. Victoria thought I was just a quiet, submissive daughter who didn't understand money. She didn't realize that by managing her accounts, I had a front-row seat to her double life. For the past 14 months, I had been tracking a series of mysterious cash withdrawals and unexplained credit card charges. 500 here, 800 there. Always on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always at locations that didn't make sense for a woman who claimed she spent her days gardening and attending book clubs. I didn't know who the money was for. I didn't know about the hotel room downtown or the expensive gifts being shipped to a P.O. box across town, but I knew the pattern. I knew she was hiding something massive. I just didn't realize how far she would go to protect it until the morning of my wedding. The envelope in Liam's hands wasn't a love letter. It was a ledger. But I'll get to the exact contents in a moment. First, you need to understand how I ended up at that altar and why my mother was so desperate to keep me from walking down it. Meeting Liam changed the gravitational pull of my life. He was an architect. Quiet, steady and grounded. But more importantly, he was Harrison's son. Harrison's family didn't just have money, they had generational, untouchable wealth, the kind of wealth that buys silence and rewrites history. When I brought Liam home the first time, Victoria didn't see the man I loved. She saw a retirement plan. She saw a status upgrade. But the dynamic shifted the moment Harrison entered the picture. Harrison was a man who measured people by their net worth and found most of them wanting. He looked at our peeling wallpaper and my mother's fake antiques with a polite, devastating pity. I hated him in that moment, but I also saw the way Victoria looked at him. It wasn't awe, it was recognition. That was the catalyst. The engagement didn't bring our families together. It put a magnifying glass over my mother's secrets. Once the wedding date was set, Victoria's passive aggression turned into outright sabotage. She would accidentally spill coffee on my dress alterations. She would schedule her book club meetings on the exact same nights as my bridal showers. She was trying to make me look unstable, unreliable, and difficult. I just smiled and took notes. Literally. I started tracking her movements. If she was going to treat me like a child, I was going to treat her like a suspect. I hired Rebecca, a forensic accountant I'd met during a grueling year working at a mid-tier audit firm. Rebecca was brilliant, cynical, and owed me a favor. I gave her the bank statements I'd been secretly photocopying for 14 months. "It's not just cash withdrawals, Viv," Rebecca told me over a cheap diner coffee, tapping a highlighted line. "Look at the dates, Tuesday and Thursday. Now look at this shell company, Apex Logistics. It's registered to a P.O. box in the financial district." "Who owns Apex?" I asked. "That's the weird part," Rebecca said, sliding a document across the sticky table. "The registered agent is a high-end law firm, but the signatory for the account, it's a man named David Miller." I stared at the name. I didn't know David Miller. But 2 days later, I found out who he was. I was at Liam's apartment, helping him sort through old boxes in the attic. I found a high school yearbook. Flipping through it, I saw a photo of Liam's father, Harrison, with his arm around a guy named David Miller. David wasn't just a random name. He was Harrison's college roommate, his best man at his first wedding. Why was my mother funneling money to her future son-in-law's best friend? The pieces were shifting, but the picture was still blurred. The tension peaked at the formal engagement dinner, hosted at Harrison's sprawling estate. The dining room was so large, the crystal chandelier looked like a distant, cold star. The air smelled of expensive lilies and roasted duck. Victoria wore a designer dress she couldn't afford, the tags probably still hidden in the lining, trying to project the image of an equal. During dessert, Harrison made a subtle, cutting remark about my humble background, suggesting I might need a strict prenup to protect Liam from my family's financial habits. It was a direct dig at my mother's hidden credit card debt. I looked at Victoria, expecting her to defend me. Instead, she laughed, a bright, hollow sound. "Oh, Harrison, you don't need to worry. Vivian has always been a bit reckless with money. We just hope she hasn't developed any other reckless habits." She looked right at me. The threat was clear. Play along or I'll ruin you. But as I looked at Victoria, I noticed something else. Her hand was shaking, just slightly. The stem of her wineglass rattled against her diamond ring. She wasn't just trying to control me, she was terrified. If I married Liam, I would become part of Harrison's inner circle. I would have access to his world. And if my mother was funneling money to Harrison's best friend, my marriage was a direct threat to her survival. I smiled, took a sip of water, and realized the wedding wasn't going to happen. Not the way she planned. Because that night, Rebecca texted me a single line. I found the hotel receipts. You need to see the name on the credit card used to pay for the room." Rebecca's text read, "The primary cardholder for the suite at the Ritz isn't David Miller, it's Harrison." I sat in my car, the engine idling, staring at the screen. The air in the vehicle suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My mother wasn't just embezzling, she was sleeping with my future father-in-law. The Apex Logistics account wasn't a mystery client. It was Harrison's personal slush fund, funneling cash to Victoria to pay for the hotel rooms, the gifts, and the silence. David Miller was just a ghost on the paperwork, a fall guy to keep Harrison's name off the bank statements. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just opened the glove compartment, pulled out the manila folder Rebecca had given me, and placed it inside the cream-colored envelope. The wedding was 3 hours. I could have called it off. I could have sent the folder to Liam's email and walked away. But if I did, Victoria would spin it. She would claim I forged it. She would play the victim, and Harrison's lawyers would bury me in defamation suits. I needed Liam to see it. I needed him to read it in his own hands, in front of God and everyone, so the truth couldn't be retroactively edited. 3 hours later, I was standing in the vestibule of the cathedral. The silk of my dress felt like armor. The door opened, and Victoria slipped in. She wasn't wearing her usual composed expression. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. She knew I had the folder. She knew Rebecca had found the receipts. "Vivienne," she hissed, grabbing my arm. Her nails dug into my skin. "You need to listen to me. I spoke to Liam. I told him." "Told him what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That you're pregnant with Greg's, your ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago, a man who barely knew my middle name." "I'm protecting this family," Victoria said, her voice trembling with a twisted sense of martyrdom. "Harrison is a good man who made a mistake. If you marry Liam, you will destroy him. You'll destroy us. So I gave Liam an out. I told him you were carrying another man's child. He's going to call it off. You'll leave town, I'll give you money, and we will never speak of this again." She actually believed her own lie. She thought destroying my life was an act of maternal love. She thought she was the hero of this story. "You're sleeping with my fiancé's father," I said, looking at her hands. "And you think I'm the disgrace?" "I'm protecting the family name," she snapped, her face twisting. "Now go out there and play your part. Cry, run away, make it believable." She turned and walked out, adjusting her veil, ready to play the grieving mother. I stood alone in the vestibule. The organ music swelled, Patchoul's canon. I picked up the cream-colored envelope. Which brings us back to the altar. Liam took the envelope. He pulled out the single sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a bank statement showing a $50,000 transfer from Harrison to Victoria, dated the day after my engagement, alongside a printed log of the Ritz-Carlton keycard swipes. I watched the color drain from his face. I watched his brain short-circuit as he looked from the paper to me and then up to his father in the front pew. Harrison saw the look on his son's face. He stood up. "Liam, what is—" He didn't let him finish. He dropped the paper. He didn't yell. He just turned and walked down the side aisle, out the heavy oak doors. The cathedral erupted. Victoria screamed. Harrison lunged forward. I didn't stay to watch. I turned around and walked out the back door into the cool afternoon air, leaving the chaos behind. I got into my car, drove to my small apartment, and locked the door. I turned on my phone. 96 missed calls. Texts from Liam, texts from Harrison, texts from Victoria. I ignored them all. I poured a glass of water, sat on my cheap IKEA sofa, and waited. I knew they wouldn't stay away. The truth is a heavy thing, and once you drop it on people, they have to pick it up. At exactly midnight, the buzzer to my apartment rang. I walked to the intercom and pressed the button. "Who is it?" "It's Liam, and my father, and your mother. Vivienne, please, we need to talk."
I looked through the peephole. All three of them were standing in the dim hallway of my building, the architects of my ruin, finally standing on my turf.
I pressed the intercom button. The heavy downstairs door clicked open with a loud buzz. I didn't move from the center of my small living room. I just listened. 3 distinct footsteps climbed the 2 flights of stairs. Victoria's sharp, impatient heels, Harrison's heavy, expensive loafers, and Liam's hesitant, dragging steps. When the door opened, the contrast was almost comical. My apartment smelled of cheap lemon cleaner and old paper. It was exactly 400 square feet. There was barely enough room for the 3 of them to stand without invading each other's space. Victoria spoke first. She didn't look like a grieving mother anymore. She looked like a cornered animal trying to bluff its way out of a trap. "Vivian, this little stunt has gone far enough," she said, her voice tight, forcing a brittle smile. "You're embarrassed about the wedding. You're lashing out. I fabricated those documents. I told Liam you've been struggling with your mental health since your brother died." She was trying to rewrite reality in real time. She was betting that Liam's desire for a comfortable, unquestioned life would outweigh his desire for the truth. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I walked past them into the tiny kitchenette and turned on the kettle. The mundane sound of water filling the metal pot seemed to deafen in the small space. If you've ever had to sit across from people who completely underestimated you, leave a comment below. There is a very specific kind of power in that silence. I made 3 cups of tea. I set them on the small IKEA dining table, then placed the thick manila folder next to them. "Sit down," I said. Harrison was the first to move. He looked at the folder, then at me. His arrogance was a heavy, suffocating thing, but for the first time, I saw a crack in it. He sat. Victoria remained standing, her hands trembling. Liam just stared at the floor. "What you handed Liam at the altar was page 1, I said, opening the folder. "Page 1 proves you're having an affair with my fiancé's father, Victoria, but pages 2 through 40 tell a very different story." I slid a bank statement across the table. "Victoria, you thought Harrison was funneling money to you because he was in love with you. You thought Apex Logistics was a romantic gift to you, a little side business to keep you in designer clothes and hotel suites." I looked up, meeting her eyes. "But Apex Logistics isn't a gift. It's a liability shield." Victoria blinked, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Harrison's real estate firm is leveraged to the hilt. He's $3 million in debt to a private equity group. The creditors are coming. So for the last 18 months, Harrison has been using Apex Logistics to siphon cash out of his corporate accounts before the bankruptcy courts can freeze them." I turned to Harrison. His face was the color of old ash. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the signature at the bottom of the LLC registration document. "Victoria's name is on the Apex operating agreement," I continued, looking at my mother. "She is the registered agent. She is the signatory. Harrison didn't make you his mistress, Victoria. He made you his money mule. When the SEC and the creditors come looking for the missing $3 million, they aren't going to come after Harrison's untouchable generational wealth. They're going to come after you." The silence in the room was absolute. Victoria let out a small, choked sound. She looked at Harrison, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. You said it was a trust. You said it was for my retirement." Harrison didn't answer. He just slowly reached for his teacup, his hand shaking so badly the porcelain rattled against the saucer. Liam finally looked up. The passive, obedient son was gone. In his place was a man who suddenly realized his entire inheritance, his family's legacy, and his father's authority were built on a graveyard of fraud. "You're bankrupt," to Harrison, Liam whispered. To his father. Harrison set the cup down. He didn't deny it. Instead, his eyes hardened, shifting from panic to a cold, transactional calculation. He looked at me, realizing the quiet, invisible girl he had dismissed was the only person in the room who actually held the keys to his survival. Harrison's panic lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the predator in him woke up. He didn't look like a grieving father or a betrayed patriarch anymore.
He looked like a man who had spent 30 years buying his way out of corners. He set his teacup down with a sharp clack against the saucer. "You're very clever, Vivian," Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous warmth. "But you're playing a game you don't understand. You think you hold the cards because you have some printed bank statements, but I have an army of lawyers who will tie this up in litigation until you're bankrupt. I will bury you." He leaned forward, invading my space, the smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour scent of his fear. "So let's negotiate," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Name your price. You walk away from Liam. You sign a non-disclosure agreement. I will wire you $2 million from a clean account by tomorrow morning. You disappear, and Victoria takes the fall for the Apex transfers. Everyone gets what they want." If you've ever watched a bully suddenly realize they aren't the biggest thing in the room, you know the exact look on Victoria's face right then. She wasn't looking at Harrison with love anymore. She was looking at him with the horrifying clarity of a woman who just realized she was the sacrifice. You said we were building a future," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "You said the money was for us." "I said what I needed to say to keep you quiet, Victoria," Harrison snapped, not even looking at her. "I needed a signatory with a fragile ego and a desperate need for status. You were perfect. Your vanity blinded you to the paperwork. Don't flatter yourself into thinking it was a romance." Victoria let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She sank into the cheap wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. The woman who had stood in a cathedral and publicly destroyed her own daughter to protect the family name now was weeping over the fact that her lover was a sociopath. I didn't feel pity for her. I just felt a profound, exhausting clarity. "I don't want your $2 million, Harrison," I said, my voice cutting through Victoria's quiet crying. "And I don't want to negotiate." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Then what do you want? Because if you walk out of this room and go to the SEC, my lawyers will drag your name through the mud. They'll claim you were a co-conspirator. They'll say you forged the documents." "I didn't forge anything," I said calmly. "But you're right about one thing. I'm not going to the SEC." Harrison blinked, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Smart girl. So we have a deal?" "No," I said. "I'm not going to the SEC because I don't need to." I turned my head to look at Liam. He was still sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't said a word since he sat down. "Liam," I said softly, "tell him." Liam slowly lifted his head. He looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, there was no deference in his eyes. There was only a cold, absolute authority. "I didn't just read the bank statements at the altar, Dad. I took a picture of them, and while you were busy trying to intimidate Vivian in her kitchen, I was on the phone with the board of directors at your firm." Harrison's face went completely slack. "What did you do?" "I invoked the morality clause in your executive contract, and I used my proxy voting shares to remove you as CEO effective 10 minutes ago. The board has already frozen your personal assets and launched an internal audit." Harrison stood up so fast, his chair ticked backward, crashing onto the linoleum floor. "You can't do that," Harrison roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "Those shares are in my trust." "Not anymore," Liam said quietly. "I transferred them to an irrevocable blind trust this afternoon. You don't own the company, Dad. You don't own the house, and as of midnight, you don't have a dime to your name." Harrison stared at his son, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The empire he had built on lies and leverage had just evaporated in the span of 3 hours. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. He finally understood. I hadn't just brought him here to expose the truth. I had brought him here to watch his world end. Harrison stared at his son, his chest heaving. The silence in the tiny apartment was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. "You stole my company," Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with a toxic mix of rage and disbelief. Liam didn't flinch. He just looked at his father with a profound, exhausting sadness. "You stole it first, Dad. You leveraged it into the ground to pay for your mistakes and your mistresses. I just took it back before it dragged me down with you." Harrison's knees gave out. He didn't fall, but he slumped heavily into the chair, burying his face in his hands. The untouchable patriarch was gone. In his place was just a desperate, aging man facing federal prison. Victoria watched him collapse. For a moment, her mask of the grieving, betrayed mother slipped entirely. Her eyes darted toward the door, calculating. "We need to move," she muttered, her voice suddenly sharp, stripped of all its previous theatricality. She stood up, smoothing her designer skirt. "Harrison, we need to liquidate the offshore accounts. If the board froze your domestic assets, they haven't touched the Cayman trusts yet. We can still save something." Liam looked at her, confused. "What offshore accounts? Dad, what is she talking about?" Harrison didn't answer. He just kept his head in his hands. I took a slow sip of my tea. It had gone cold, but I didn't mind. "That's the final piece, Liam," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out the very last document. It was a single page, printed on heavy, watermarked paper. I slid it across the table, stopping it right in front of Victoria. She froze. Her hand hovered over the paper, but she didn't pick it up. Victoria wasn't just a money mule, Liam, and she wasn't just a desperate woman trying to protect her reputation at the altar today. She's a lot smarter than that. Liam picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the wire transfer receipt. $3 million, he read aloud, transferred yesterday morning to a shell corporation in Belize. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "But Dad, your accounts were empty. The board said you were leveraged." "They were," I said. "Harrison didn't transfer that money. He thought they were lost in bad real estate deals. He didn't know that 6 months ago, Victoria figured out he was embezzling." I finally looked directly at my mother. Her face was completely devoid of color. The illusion was dead. I continued, my voice perfectly level. When Victoria realized Harrison was bankrupt, she didn't leave him. She took over the Apex Logistics account. She drained the $3 million herself. She was going to let Harrison take the fall for the missing money, collect the wedding gifts from his remaining clean assets, and disappear to Belize. Liam stared at Victoria, horror dawning in his eyes. "You stole it. You stole $3 million from my father." "It wasn't going to lose it anyway," Victoria suddenly shrieked, her composure shattering completely. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Harrison. "He was a fool. He was going to drag us all down. I just took what was owed to me for putting up with him." She turned to me, her eyes wild. "And you ruined it. I told Liam you were pregnant to create a distraction. I needed a scandal. I needed him to call off the wedding so I could slip away with the cash while everyone was looking at you." The final twist hung in the air. Her lie at the altar wasn't an act of maternal protection. It wasn't about the family name. It was a tactical diversion. She had manufactured a massive, undeniable crisis to cover her own tracks. She was willing to destroy my life, my engagement, and my reputation just to buy herself a 3-hour head start to flee the country. Liam slowly stood up. He looked at his father, a broken criminal. Then he looked at my mother, a mastermind thief. Finally, he looked at me. "You knew," Liam said softly. It wasn't a question. "I knew," I replied. "And you still handed him the envelope." "I didn't hand it to him to save you, Liam. I handed it to him because you needed to see exactly what kind of people you were defending." Victoria's phone buzzed on the cheap IKEA table. She glanced at the screen, and the last remnants of color vanished from her face. "My bank app," she whispered. "It's as my accounts are frozen, all of them." I took a slow sip of my cold tea. Rebecca didn't just find the Belize account, Victoria. She flagged it. When you wire $3 million to an unregistered offshore trust, it triggers an international red flag. She anonymously tipped off the SEC and the FBI at 8 a.m. this morning. Your passport was revoked at the border an hour ago. Victoria stared at me, her mouth slightly open. The grand escape she had sacrificed my happiness for was a ghost. Harrison didn't say a word. He just stood up, his shoulders slumped, looking every single one of his 60 years. He walked to the door, his expensive loafers scuffing quietly against the linoleum. Victoria followed him, her designer heels clicking a hollow, defeated rhythm. They didn't look back. They just walked out into the hallway, two ghosts haunting a life they had tried to steal. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The apartment was finally quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of city traffic. Liam was still sitting at the table. He looked at the empty doorway, then down at his hands. "You didn't just expose them. You orchestrated it. You let the wedding happen. You let my father try to buy you off. You let my mother scream at you in the vestibule. I let them show me exactly who they were, and I let them show you." Liam looked up at me. His eyes were red, but he didn't cry. "What about us, Vivian? Is there any way—" "Liam," I interrupted gently, "you believed her lie. You didn't know she was lying about the pregnancy, but you were entirely willing to believe I was capable of betraying you. You chose her narrative over my character. The envelope didn't break us. It just revealed that we were already broken." He nodded slowly. He understood. He stood up, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the knob. "You're terrifying, you know that." "I'm prepared," I corrected. He left. I walked over to the kitchenette and poured the cold tea down the sink. I washed the 3 cups, dried them, and put them away. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't call my friends. I just walked over to the window and looked out at the streetlights. People think power is loud. They think it's screaming matches, dramatic confrontations, and public takedowns. But true power is quiet. True power is knowing the truth, gathering the evidence, and waiting for the exact right moment to let it speak for itself. My mother spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, that I was a burden, that I would never amount to anything. She thought my silence meant I was weak. She never realized that my silence was just me listening. You don't have to burn the house down to prove you own it. Sometimes you just have to hand the architect the blueprints and watch him realize the foundation is made of sand. If this story reminded you that your worth was never determined by someone else's approval and that the truth will always outlast a lie, share it with someone who needs to hear it.